Now I think we're finally ready to hear from our first speaker of the evening, and he's no stranger to many of us. He's been attending our Tea Party meetings. John Hancock. I met John first time at the gun show in Ontario. And we talked for quite a while, and I feel like he's a friend. He certainly knows what he's talking about. He was very generous in giving me his book, and I read it through, and I'm very impressed with the work that he is doing. So I'm going to turn the mic over to him without taking more time, and he will tell you about his book. They're up here on the table, which you can look at after the meeting. So John, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say that, yes, my name is John Hancock. I often get a thing, well, is that a real name or is that a pen name? Because I write history. And it's just one of those things, maybe that's why I love history. As a kid, I always loved history. Never read sci-fi, didn't get into fantasy. It was always history books. And one of the reasons I love history is because as I read events in the past, not only were they exciting or they discuss a bygone age. Put this up, I guess. Okay, is that better? Okay. Or bygone age. I actually learned so much about our time and what's going around us, and I get to see kind of an enlightenment in a way that a lot of people who don't read history don't have. I get to see things, how they set in the development and the context of the history of man. And to me, I love when I experience that. It's almost like an epiphany or again, a deeper understanding. And that's what happened when I wrote Liberty and Heritage. I started studying the English history. I wanted to look at what our founding fathers were building on and what was their experiences, what was their history, and what was the world like when they came about and when they were creating all this. So I wrote Liberty and Heritage, and I was studying the English history, and I was amazed because the more I understood the English history, the more I understood our history. And one of the things I say when I go out and speak is, or just anybody, if you don't understand the glorious revolution of 1688 that occurred in England, you really do not understand the revolution of 1776. Because the revolution of 1776 was just an extension of the revolution of 1688. But if you remember, what were they fighting for and complaining about what was being taken away by King George III was the rights as Englishmen. That's what the Founding Fathers kept saying up until the Declaration of Independence. They only did the Declaration of Independence when they realized that they couldn't come to agreement with London, that the Parliament and the King was not going to respect their wishes. So that's one of the reasons I like history. And the other thing I like about history is when I do studying is sometimes, or I really enjoy where it takes me from one event to another. And that's what happened when I was, again, writing this book, because I started seeing something about the Dutch. When I was researching the English history, I started seeing about the Dutch history, the Dutch. And I was like, well, there's something there. There just seemed to be another chapter before even the English chapter. And so I started researching the Dutch history. I want to share with you a little bit of what I found, because that's going to comprise the next book I'm doing, which should be out in January, called The Proven Alternative. And one of the things I felt was that there was a connection between the Dutch and the English and of course us, ultimately the Americans. And I was doing some research and I came across this quote by an American historian. He was famous at the time. This was actually written in 1855, over 150 years ago. And he wrote, "The so-called revolutions of Holland, England, and America are all links of one chain." You know, what is he talking about? All links of one chain. And it's real interesting. He prefaces this by saying all school children know that the so-called revolutions of Holland, England, and America are links in one chain. Well, he goes on to explain that they are portions of the record of Anglo-Saxons, that basically it's Anglo-Saxon history, and that it essentially the struggle was the same whether it was in Friesland, in England, or in Massachusetts. In other words, it was a struggle of the individual person against tyranny, against despotism. And this is echoed by an Irish historian who wrote almost 200 years ago that the Dutch offer the distinctive characteristics of the Saxon people, the details of laws and manners similar to that of England. Now again, this was written in the 1820s. And it's amazing that we do not know this history anymore. But what is the details of laws and the manners of the Saxons? What is unique to them? Well, again, further research, the unique principle was these. They were for limited government. They were for individual liberty, the right of the individual being superior to the collective, being superior to the government, not subservient. Not a servant of the government. The government was a servant of the individual. And those two there made up the political rights. They actually believed in property rights. The idea that a common person could own property in his own name. Not the name of the collective, not the name of the family, but in his, and even in England very early in the 1500s, her own name. It was amazing at the time. And it was economic freedom. The idea that you could go and do business as you liked with whoever you wanted, as long as you did not harm another person. No theft, no fraud. It was all up on top, fair-based. And again, these were the unique values that came from the Saxons, because back then, no one else in the world had them. Not the French, not the Spaniards, not the Chinese, not the Russians. This is very unique to the Saxons. And they would evolve in time to be called Whiggism. Now, how many of you remember what was preceding the Republican Party was the Whig Party, right, in the United States, and there was the Whig Party over in Britain, or in England. Whiggism, that was the English version of this. It became liberalism globally. And then, once the progressives, back in the early 1900s, kind of ruined their name and people saw them for who they were, they had to find another way to describe themselves. So they co-opted the title of liberalism. And fortunate for them, the academics were nice enough to relabel real liberalism to classical liberalism. And these are the system, or these are the principles that ultimately the United States was founded on, and we became a great nation because of. Now, as I mentioned before, modern liberalism has nothing to do with these principles. Okay? They are contrary to them. Unfortunately, there's a lot, or there's too few people who call themselves conservatives that abide by these principles also. Really, these principles have not been around in this country for over 100 years, or at least not being paid more than lip service to. They aren't really embraced and believed in. But we are lucky because, like I said, we have countries that came before us. And here's that quote by the historian Motley, but this time I included the date. So we have the Holland Revolution in 1568, followed by the English Revolution in 1688, and the American Revolution in 1776. So what that means is we have a history of 400 to 500 years, a written history with documentation of how these principles work. Basically, what type of society did they produce? Now this is very important, and I will explain why at the end of the presentation. But let's look at the first one. Let's look at the Dutch, which was the 15th and 16th century. Now, the Dutch were a pretty unique country, because after the fall of Rome, they came under the control of various despotic kingdoms, including the Austrians, the French, and ultimately the Spanish, until they were able in the middle of the 1500s to get rid of Spanish despotism. So what they did, being Saxon people, they resorted back to their traditional Saxon values, and they implemented them. Well, what happened was that as economic historian from BYU by the name of Donald Harold wrote that in just over 100 years, the provinces of the Netherlands went from relative obscurity to the pinnacle of European commercial success. In 100 years, Amsterdam went from a little backwaters town to the financial capital of not only Europe, but the world. They actually became the biggest empire of the time. A lot of you probably are familiar with the Dutch East Indies Empire and all this. They ended up developing a navy and a merchant marine of 10,000 ships, manned by 160 sailors. Now, this is a country that's the size of the state of Maryland. So we aren't talking about a big, huge country here. And remember, they were backwaters, they were poor. And they actually came up with the first stock market, they had all these functions. But what was more important was what happened to the common people. Because we're always hearing, right, capitalism and these principles make things unfair, and the people, the common people are treated so badly. Well, they actually became with the highest literacy rate in Europe at the time. They actually ended up having the biggest middle class. So if you want to talk about preserving a middle class, those principles won't preserve a middle class. They grow it. They make it keep growing, and I'll keep showing you more later. There was a diet of the common people. They had meat at least 3 times a day. That's how wealthy they were. Their houses, they had houses that they lived in. They had, actually this was called the Dutch Golden Years. And it's real interesting, is this portrait here. If you look at French or Spanish or Austrian paintings of the time, you would see they were royalty, nobles, the aristocracy, because those were the only people who could afford to paint a painter, or to pay a painter to paint them, to do a portrait. But if you look at Dutch paintings like this one, this is a common household. This is middle-class household. And it's showing them they have food, they're playing chess, they have pets, they have a nice house. The country was so wealthy, the individual people became so wealthy because society was so wealthy that they had a standard of living that no one else had in Europe. The common people could actually afford to paint, or to have an artist paint them. Again, we see this over and over again, because as we go to the next one, which you're probably a little bit more familiar with, is the British, the English. Now the English adopted the same thing, because as we know, the Saxons went to England, and a more modern historian, he's currently one of the top historians in Britain, his name's David Starkey. If you ever can go on Netflix, he does a great video called Monarchy. But he wrote, in Britannia, the Anglo-Saxons brought a new society and a new, very different set of political values. They would devise in free market economics a new form of business that would transform human wealth and welfare for the better. Most importantly, they would invent a new politics which depended on participation, consent rather than top-down autocracy. This was something new. And if you read this, you will see all 4 of those principles: private property, free market economics, limited government, and the individual right, or the supremacy of the individual, are all there. Now we know how powerful Britain became with these philosophies, with these principles. They became the biggest empire the world has ever seen. More importantly, the average people, again, had a higher standard of living, had a higher lifestyle. Even the poorest Englander was better off than a common person in France or Spain or Austria or anywhere else in the world. So again, the society became very wealthy, that even the lower end were better off, and these are the benefits of these 4 principles. Now we'll go to the 4th one, which you should be very familiar with, or the 3rd one, and that's the Americans. That's us. Okay, in 200 years, and I think any of you who read the 5,000-Year Leap would recognize this, that within 200 years, the United States advanced the world more than the world had the previous 5,000. These principles took the United States from planting a plow in the earth to planting a flag on the moon. Okay, we see again the principles working. Look at the poor Americans. Okay, the poor people in America. Even they are better off than the average person in the rest of the world. I mean, the statistics are amazing. If you are poor in America, you're still one of the top 25% richest people in the world. So these values over and over again have proven themselves to grow and help and prosper. So my question then goes to the fourth one, and this one's real interesting because I always get that question. Okay, John, you're naming the successful. You know, it's kind of like naming the big, the music stars and the movie stars. What about all the people, the has-beens that didn't have all that we had? Didn't have the whatever special things that America or the English or the Dutch had. Well, I want to share with you some amazing statistics from today. This is the modern world. Now, per capita ranking GDP in 2009, this is from the IMF, 11 of the top 20 were based on what I call the Saxon system. They were based on those four principles. Okay? Life expectancy, which shows the quality of living. The higher the quality of living, the longer you're expected to live. The lower quality of living, chances are you're not going to live that long. Well, the life expectancy ranking, this is from the United Nations, 5 of the top 20 are former British dominions or part of the British system. Again, they incorporated and they inherited, like us, that Saxon system, those Saxon principles. Now, the top nation in every region of the world, except Latin America, was a former British colony or part of the British system at one time. And when I mean the top nation, I mean they are the political, military, and economic power of that part of the world. The only reason they're not in Latin America is because the British and the English never had a strong presence in Latin America. Now, it's real interesting that if we look at these first two, there is not one former French or Spanish colony that made the top 20 of either list. But there are several British colonies in there. And I think that says a lot on how powerful these principles are in making countries such as the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong. We can keep going on the list of these prosperous countries. And they all have different races, they all have different attributes, different assets that they each incorporate, but one thing that they have in common, those four values that they share. The index of freedom, 6 of the top 10 are based, or were Anglo-Saxon countries, are based on the Saxon system. Countries with the top average income, 4 of the top 10 are based on the English system. Now, I just want to make a note here on some of these statistics, because I'm mainly looking at the countries that were part of the empire. But within there, or part of the British system at one point. But what is in here too is countries like Japan, who was not part of the British system, but basically inherited it by American presence after World War II and the reconstruction of that country that started with MacArthur. And lastly, the Better Life Index. 4 of the top 10 countries in the Better Life Index, which just came out a couple months ago, was again English-speaking countries or countries that were based on the English-Saxon principles. Australia came in number 1, and New Zealand came in number 11. So they just barely missed the top 10. And the last one, this came out this morning, so I quickly added it in. If you look at the countries, again, that was based on those four principles, the English system, the Saxon system, they dominate the least corrupt nations in the world list. They are at the top. In fact, in that case, New Zealand ties for first place as the least corrupt nation on the earth. So this is all kind of a neat, a real abbreviated part of history and some facts, but why does it matter? This is why I love history, why does it matter looking at these old things? Well, let's look at the track record of what I call the popular alternative. The alternative that is being pushed on us today, and we are told that this is the key to the future. This is going to bring prosperity. Well, I call it what it is. Okay, I say that the system we have and those principles that we were talking about, those four principles, are Saxon, because that's where they originated from. They were the group of people that developed those principles, and then they evolved over time. What we are talking about today, the popular alternative, originated with Marxism. It is Marxism. There's no doubt about it. The principles, the philosophy, the point of view of life is Marxist. So I call this the Marxist track record. So let's look at the Marxist track record. Well, we know it hasn't been along for 500 years like the Saxons. It's been around since probably about the 1840s, 1880s, and then it took off around the 1900s. So it does not have a long history, but it does have a history. And unfortunately, that history is not very positive, because it promises a lot. It always promises to alleviate the pain, to alleviate the suffering, just like a drug. But in the end, it doesn't do that. And if you take a drug long enough, it moves you from the paradise that it promises to the reality of a living hell. It does not bring prosperity, security, and freedom and wealth to the societies that embrace it. It bankrupts them. If it did, then the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War, not the United States. But they went bankrupt. And every society that has embraced all forms of Marxism, even Western Europe now, are going bankrupt. The Swedes, who when I was getting my degree in international business, the Swedes were the poster children of a mixed economy, of how socialism and capitalism can be blended to create this incredible, ideal, perfect, utopian economic system. But now even the Swedes are saying, wait a minute, no more, this is breaking us. And they're trying to dial back all this socialism that they instilled in their system. The problem is that once you get people used to the handout, used to being taken care of, they don't want it dialed back. So what happens is they demand more. And even if they get it, the next generation demands more than what their parents had. And it's this cycle that just keeps going. So what happens is, in the end, the politicians cannot fulfill the promises. So what do they have to do? They have to resort to the bayonet. That is how they have to control people. So my question is, tonight, and why this is so important, is if we have the system that has a 500-year track record of prosperity, freedom, liberty, security, and wealth to not only the society, but to the ordinary individual citizens, why are we choosing the proven loser? Well, it's because no one's taught this. We as people are fairly, not educated. And it was amazing to me when I read that, because I thought, I'm a student of history all my life. And I was still amazed when I discovered that quote about the Holland, the English, and the American Revolutions being one chain. I felt kind of embarrassed when he prefaced it with the comment that all school children know. Well, all school children did know back then. But our school system has been completely taken over. They aren't teaching anything like this anymore, because if they did, no one would want that other system. Go back. No one would want this. It can't stand up to what we have and what this country was built on. Instead, it's easier to say that we became wealthy and prosperous off of slavery or exploiting other countries. It's not our system of government. It's not who we are culturally, because that's the whole thing about the Saxon system, like I mentioned before, Singapore, Hong Kong, these countries that are not English Europeans, they are of other races. This can be embraced by everybody. It's a cultural. So why are we getting all this? Well, it's real interesting. I was listening to Aldous Huxley, and I think if you remember him, he wrote The Brave New World. And I highly recommend, if you go search on the internet, he spoke in 1962 at UC Berkeley. And he said the totalitarian governments all start the same way. They have to corrupt the mind. And when he said what is going on, and he said this, but starting in 1962 was an effort, a revolution to get people to fall in love with servitude. They will embrace slavery. And this will be done, as he put it, through the politicians, the editors of the media, and the teachers in the classroom. That was in 1962, 60 years ago. And now it's come true. People are embracing their servitude. So this is why I write books like Liberty Inherited. Liberty Inherited connects to the first two I talked about, the American and the English Revolution. My next book, which will be out in January, I'm finishing up the research on it now. My next book will be The Proven Alternative, which will take it to the next step down and provide a lot of detail. And I write these books because not only do I like history, because I'm sitting there going, well, other people should know this, but because we have to start educating ourselves, and then we have to start educating others. And this is what I see my goal in life, because as someone who loves history, I see my goal in life is to provide people like you with the historical evidence, the historical knowledge, that when you go and you talk to your neighbors, and they sit there and tell you, hey, you just want to take us back to the you just want to return us to the failed policies of the past. How many times have we heard that? Our glorious leader tells that about us all the time, right? Those people, they just want to return to the failed policies of the past. I say, yeah, we want to return to the policies of the past, but they didn't fail. They have a 500-year history of success. This is what we need to be telling people. This is what we need to be telling our children and our grandchildren. This is what brings prosperity. This is what the best system to limit suffering within a country. The only thing that the other system makes equal is the suffering. Here, this gives everybody a chance at prosperity. And even the poorer. And even though there is economic inequality, those who are at the bottom are better off than societies that don't embrace these values and these principles. And that's a fact. So I will be here. I know we're kind of over, so I will be here afterwards. I have some books here. They're $15 for one, or two for $25, and we do cash. Of course, we have a thing for credit cards and all that, and this helps me turn around and do more speaking. In fact, the other thing is too, if you're from other groups, or you go, and I know people kind of cross-pollinate, you go to different groups, I'm always willing to speak, so I'm looking for speaking opportunities. And I'm going to be passing out the form. I'll be passing out in a few minutes with an email. If you want to put your email on there, I'm going to be sending out an exclusive offer for a discount on the Proven Alternative when it's ready, so you can pre-order that at a big discount, because I like helping groups. So please, if you want to do that and stay in touch, you can do that. I don't know if we have time for questions. Okay, do we have any questions?
We should have had paper distributed to the tables, paper and pen. Are there questions that have been written already? Raise your hand and we'll bring them to the podium. Don and I are the tall and short of it. Commercial time. How many of you would like to have John come back when he finishes the second book?